Welcome to The Know. I'm Ashley Jenkins.
I'm John Rising.
It's been nearly 5 years since an official entry in the Resident Evil game franchise, but that's all about to change tomorrow, or midnight, or if you were one of the people who got sent it early, already, with the release of Resident Evil VII Biohazard.
Time doesn't exist. Everyone has Resident Evil 7. So, with the return back to the series' origins, the game has naturally been prompting people to wonder, is it good?
Is it?
We'll find out when we read more. Reviews are dropping for the game as of this morning, and so far, well, the verdict is looking pretty good. So there's the spoiler.
So rejoice, survival horror fans, because Resident Evil 7 Biohazard has a Metacritic score of 86.
Ooh.
At the time of writing, that will probably shift a little bit as more and more reviews come in. But compared to some of the more core recent iterations of Resident Evil, that 86, that's a bit of a curve record. 2016's Umbrella Core averaged a whopping 37.
That's a lot lower.
2015's Resident Evil Revelations 2 netted a 75, so there's something. And 2012's Resident Evil 6 held down at 70 on its original platforms.
So that 86 is actually the highest score for a Resident Evil game since Resident Evil 4's 96 in 2005, the old long ago. Although
the before time.
Yeah, the before time. Resident Evil 5 was fairly close with an 84.
As for the individual press outlets, The Guardian and Destructoid gave it perfect scores with 5 out of 5 stars and 10 out of 10 tens. While EGM gave it a 9.5, Games Radar 4.5 out of 5 stars, Polygon and Shack News gave it 9 out of 10, and PC Gamer gave it 90 out of 100.
Wow, those are really impressive. Slightly lower were Game Informer at 8.5, Telegraph at 4 out of 5 stars, GameSpot at 8 out of 10, US Gamer at 8 out of 10, and IGN at 7.7 out of 10.
Now, as far as the positives go, critics celebrated the game for being a proper return to form. Now, they also loved how truly scary the game is, praised its pacing and its memorable boss battles.
Ooh, those are good. On the negative side, some complained that it suffers from horror fatigue with too many jump scares, while others said its ending was disappointing, and some felt that its visuals aren't very next gen.
However, it should be stressed that those criticisms were pretty few and far between, because for the most part, the reviews for this game are, well, they're glowing. Yeah, The Guardian, for instance, called it a masterclass of terror, which is pretty praiseful, and Destructoid called it the best Resident Evil game in 10 years.
Although, let's be fair, that bar is not very high. Of course, one of the biggest questions is how the new game feels. While it's going back to some of the gameplay staples of the original titles, it's also making a big switch to that first person we just talked about.
Right, and long-term fans will be happy to know that the switch, it doesn't really seem to hamper the gameplay at all. The Guardian writes, with a shift to a first-person perspective, Resident Evil 7 looks like a vivid reinvention. In fact, it rigorously follows the template established by the formative games in the series.
They went on to say there's a far greater emphasis on jump scares and fright making, those gory face-offs with family members, the effectiveness of which is grimly compounded by the perspective shift.
And many other critics echoed the sentiment that the first-person perspective only heightened the usual levels of fear, with several reviewers likening Biohazard to certain sections of Amnesia, Outlast, and PT.
Yeah, you can't get those jump scares quite right unless you're like right in there and you're looking through your eyes and that kind of thing.
Which gets extra scary when we talk about VR.
Cool. EGM said of the first-person perspective, it left me feeling incredibly tense with each step I took through the Baker residence, as the creepiness of the setting, with mutilated dolls, rotting meat, and bugs everywhere, was always right in my face.
Gross. Despite that shift, it feels like an old school Resident Evil game with tons of locked doors, puzzles, and plenty of places to explore. Giant Bomb said, this doesn't play like a first-person shooter, it plays like a Resident Evil game that happens to be in first person.
But, of course, we all know that would lead to a bit of a chore if the game didn't know how to pace it out. And fortunately, Resident Evil 7 delivers that in that regard as well.
Destructoid, in particular, praised the game's pacing, stating, if I had to draw any comparisons to the themes and atmosphere of a movie, I'd equate this to the mercurial mix of fear and levity found in the Evil Dead films. This isn't to say that there's slapstick comedy in the game, but it knows when to freak you the fuck out and when to step off the gas for a second.
A big part of the game's excellent pacing comes from Resident Evil 7's superb design and the layout. Games Radar said in its review, the beautifully designed house gradually opens up as you unlock areas and routes, expanding and looping in and around itself, making it all too easy to rush into previously safe areas without thinking about how things might have changed since you were last there.
Others mentioned the game's emphasis on crafting as being one of its strong suits. Eurogamer said, the game's stripped-down crafting system adds to the pressure. It sees you mixing sachets of chemical fluid with various raw materials, and you'll always have more of the latter than the former, which creates some pleasant quandaries. Is it worth topping up your supply of grenade launcher rounds, or should you hedge your bets and craft another healing spray?
One of the big draws of Resident Evil 7 is the Baker family itself, who stalks you much in the way that Resident Evil 3's Nemesis did, making for some very tense situations. Some of these are scripted, and some of them aren't, always keeping you on your toes.
These showdowns with the Bakers were definitely the highlight for many critics who likened the encounters to Metal Gear Solid's boss fights.
Ars Technica said about these encounters, I wish I could gush about the game's craziest moments. I could pound out 5 spoiler-filled paragraphs explaining how dramatic, wild, and thrillingly presented each of them were.
Although not everyone loved the boss battles, so it may be kind of a take it or leave it sort of thing. Games Radar wrote, the boss fights tread a fine line between frustration and brilliance, which one you get largely depends on luck.
And a few other reviewers agreed that boss battles can be a bit obtuse without much indication as to what you should be doing. Couple that with the fact that the Bakers show up unscripted, and you're sometimes left confused about if you're supposed to fight or run in general.
The answer's always run.
Yeah, that's for me.
Only fight if you can't run. While we're talking about the game's criticisms, others found the story to start well, but and kind of poorly. A Telegraph said, being a Resident Evil game, the plot isn't immune to daft excess, and when it tries to add an unneeded layer of complexity later on, somehow manages to tie itself in a knot.
Others found the game gets a little too linear in its final chapters. US Gamer criticized the final section, writing, the game does falter though. As I said before, the first half of the game is more freeform, pushing the player to explore. The game then becomes more linear, takes a detour into reliving Resident Evil Revelations, and then it heads back to linear town for the combat-heavy finale.
In general, the game seems to have left some reviewers down in the final moments. Some found the last boss to be disappointing compared to the fun encounters with the Bakers, and those heavily publicized multiple endings are basically the same with just slight variations.
And lastly, the other big criticism noted in a couple of reviews would have to be the game's visuals. While the RE engine looks great in the darkness and particularly shows off well in HDR, some did call out that textures are slow to load and that some of the game's few daytime scenes don't look particularly great. But again, those complaints were a bit sparse.
Besides being the first proper Resident Evil game in a long time, Biohazard also benefits from a little bit, just a tiny bit, of VR hype.
Okay.
The whole game is playable in virtual reality thanks to PlayStation VR, which honestly may account for some of the graphics as they made accommodations. And for you PlayStation VR owners out there, it sounds like the game succeeds very well on that front.
Yeah, several reviewers noted just how much scarier the game is in VR. Eurogamer called it imperfect but quietly gripping.
Meanwhile, Games Radar wrote, I played the opening hour and a few other levels in virtual reality and screamed a lot, ending up during one extended sequence, curled fetal on my side, attempting to balance playing and hiding at the same time. It didn't work very well. It's terrifying, and there are sections I played in normal TVO vision that I don't think I could have done in VR.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree on that part. I ain't gonna do these kind of games.
Man,
in VR.
I'm a sissy just to begin with.
Yeah.
Like this is bad for me.
Your mileage will vary, of course, on your enjoyment of Resident Evil 7 in virtual reality. There are some trade-offs. The game apparently looks like a last-gen title in VR unless you've got a PS4 Pro, and others said they could only handle the intensity in short stretches.
So all in all, it sounds like Resident Evil 7 is a great game for the true horror fans out there, especially if you like wetting yourself. It's a short, very tight experience packed full of scares, also happens to be highly replayable. Couple of downsides, but meh.
If you're looking for an amazing story, you might be a bit disappointed with the end, but in all, the game delivers a truly frightening experience that should please old and new fans alike.
And really, with the Resident Evil game, isn't that, like, that's the priority,
Yep.
right? Yeah. So what do you guys think of the early reviews of Resident Evil 7? You picking the game up? Let us know in the comments.
For more reviews on your favorite new releases, like this video and subscribe to The Know.
I did see a couple comments about this that it's a lot of people feel like it's probably more of a Chainsaw Massacre game, but the people who've played this will tell you it's addressed very early on. It is a proper Resident Evil game. And a lot of people are kind of thrown by the first person perspective, which is not usual for Resident Evil games, but still feels really good.